Hello, orators, and welcome to the 5th week of the mini lectures. This week, we're going to be covering some of the content related to preparing for your great big workshops, which really are just a case of you're going to be teaching your classmates. So again, 3 short lectures. Here's the first one. Well, let's move along. All right, so a recap of what you were supposed to read. So the only new thing out of the handbook for this week, remember that's your Scully handbook, was pages 29 to 33. This is a bit of future reading. Really, it's talking about speech construction. Some of it is going to be very helpful for your group work, but really this is when you're speaking on your own, is the idea here. The OER, your eCampus resource, that you've got a series of sections that you're looking at, and they really focus on how you work as a group, some of the challenges you'll encounter when you're working as a group, and then some specific teaching tips. In our class, you'll be doing a small talk in week 5, and again, you will be doing group work. A reminder, you are going to have to submit slides before all groups present. So before presentations start in week 6, presenters from group week 6 and week 7 are going to have to submit their slides. So, speech construction. Bookmark this for yourself because this is going to be really important stuff when you go to prepare your actual final speeches, which is going to happen in the second half of the course. One of the most solid approaches is the rule of 3. It's not just happen chance that I typically upload 3 mini lectures a week. The human psyche resonates really well with this rule of 3. 3 correlated sounds, lists appearing in groups of 3. Think back to your high school days. You had to do an essay, had an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. Within the body, you had to have the claim you were making, the reasoning, and the evidence. And the body was divided into 3 core arguments usually. We've looked at Aristotle and some of his principles when it comes to how we establish ourselves as speakers, how we make our credibility come across as legitimate with the audience, ethos, pathos, logos, and more recently in sort of a business context, some of you know of Dale Carnegie, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. Obviously, that is a super simplified approach, but if you use that general principle, you're going to do well. All righty, applying the rule of 3. So it is critical, your handbook explains this in great detail, that each of the 3 elements have to be weighed equally. They have to be in the same kind of a situation. They have to be in the same kind of a context. They have to make the reader feel that they are of the same importance, that they're balanced. So here's a really good example from Martin Luther King Jr. And you can see that there are 3 distinct segments in that quote that has been provided, and they're big enough phrases that they're separated with semicolons. Of course, you don't have to do something as significant as this. However, it is handy. Another one, based on some of the readings that you should have done, some of the watching that you did last week, you might come up with a list of what listening requires in terms of 1, 2, 3 listening. Other examples, how you might effectively study, how you might engage your audience. You can come up with some of your own ideas. When you are presenting to your classmates, I said your best and most successful approach is going to be to use your notes page from your PowerPoints and then print those out. Use your highlighters, use a colored pen. You don't have to print them in color. I think better in color. So I don't believe the original student work was necessarily in color, but the photocopies that I made of them or the pictures I took of them were definitely color pictures that I took. So you can see the kinds of notes that the students made and how they highlighted what it was they were going to be speaking about. So the TEDx person that they had was this woman, Melissa Fleming, and they really wanted to emphasize how rate ties to the right brain. And at the very bottom, I'm not sure how large this is on your screen, but it even explains how previous groups talked about prosody from the week before, facial expressions, and gestures and hand movement. So again, you want to reference your classmates, you want to reference what they're talking about, or previous lectures that you had where I have provided some information. When you're preparing those trigger sheets for your PPTs, you're still going to lay them down on a desk or have them sort of stacked up, because there will be 4 of you at the front of the classroom, so that you'll be able to slide across your pages very comfortably when it is your turn. Again, really critical, this last point, practice with your triggers. I have seen students who prepare their triggers and never use them to rehearse and then have no idea what it is that they meant with a particular comment. Verbal signposts. These are the things that help the audience know where you are in a presentation. Look at that. We got 3 key rules: how they preview, how you change direction, and how you summarize. So you'll have all sorts of guides in terms of effective language use, transitional words, how you remind the audience about what the purpose is. You give that thesis. You know how I asked all groups to have for week 4 a submission of what their topic is, who their group members are, and what your thesis statement is? The thesis statement has to be small enough, concise enough. And the hint I gave you was the X nonverbal is critical to success in public speaking. Essentially, everybody's going to argue that their nonverbal is one of the most important elements of all of the nonverbals when you're presenting. And each person in your team should restate that core thesis. Here are a few examples from students where I've kind of paraphrased, and you can say which ones, you can see which ones require citations, which ones don't. So starting at the top there in chapter 4, section 24 of the eCampus Ontario text, the discussion of paralanguage clearly explained the value and use of pausing and silences. You do not, when you're speaking this to the class, have to provide the reference. However, for me, if you have the notes, you should be providing a reference. I have the citations, the in-text citations listed with each of these snippets so that you know how you would reference it. The next example is referencing both Scully and the OER, and I use the terms OER, eCampus, open resource, textbook, all interchangeably. In both Scully and the OER, we learned about space, taking space, and presenting with authority. You can see the references listed there. Notice when you have 2 references, they're divided by a semicolon, and they are listed alphabetically. And the next one, from some previous group of students who had presented, as Alex shared in the persona presentation, we all adapt our persona based on audience and situation. In the context of today's workshop, you'll develop a better understanding of how this ties to volumes: loud, soft, volume hits. So this is an example of a passage that the student had written out, and I usually say the introduction you should write out verbatim, so you make sure you capture all of your ideas, and then you can ad lib as necessary, but then you've got all of the content there. And you can see the 4th example listed as well. Okay, and the final thing I wanted to remind you about was use the assignment notes. The assignment notes are critical. You can see that there are 4 key areas. That's why we have 4 key presents. sort of presentation aspect, and you're in groups of 4, so everybody can take one component, the significance of your nonverbal, your TED video, how the nonverbal translates across cultures, and then teaching tips. The teaching tip sometimes is on the light end, so you'll have a little bit of content that goes back with that as well. Each time when the TED Talk is introduced, that person is responsible for providing context and bridging us into the meat that was presented beforehand in terms of the substance of the actual nonverbal. And again, the person who is speaking about the nonverbal culturally across other languages also is going to have to provide some context back to whatever was introduced earlier in the presentation. PowerPoint slides, one single design for the whole group. It should look coherent. There should be imagery that's used in there, clip art. If you're using the clip art that's available through PowerPoint, you don't have to reference it. If you're pulling images from online, you need to reference it. And then you can see the marking grid that I use. It is a variation on the DAV, plus a couple of other categories that I'll be using that to assess you both as a group and individually. So if you end up really not doing your portion of it, well, your portion is going to be slightly poorer in the final grade than maybe some of your teammates. Okay. And that's pretty much it for the first short lecture.